Hi folks, my name is John Spinney. I am with the Vermont Agency of Education. I am a postsecondary transition specialist, and today we're going to talk about postsecondary transition planning in special education. Just a quick reminder, if you do have questions, please type them into the questions box, not the chat box. If you type them into the chat box, I will not be able to see them. So type them into the question box, and I will make sure that I address all the questions by the end of the webinar. Sometimes I might chime in on a question if it's pertinent to the content we're talking about. So just a couple quick pieces of information about myself. I've been at the Agency of Education for about 7 years. So some of you may just remember, we were Vermont Department of Education. We just became an agency this past January. And that just means that rather than a commissioner that reports to the State Board of Ed, we have a Secretary of Education that is on the cabinet of the governor. So that's just a little shift. And hopefully we are going to be having a more systematic, collaborative approach with our other agencies like Agency of Human Services. My role actually has already always been connected to those other folks as well. So anyway, I also have 2 siblings who have Down syndrome who were a part of special needs adoption, and that is actually how I have ended up in the world of special education. Both of my parents were also special educators, and my sister is a special educator. So why don't we get started? I'm going to go through some of the content here, and like I said, just chime in with your questions, and we'll let them collect, and I'll address them later. So the transition concept, what is it we're talking about here? So the concept of transition for high school students with disabilities is simple, and it generally has 3 components. Coach every student along with his or her family to think about goals for life after high school and to develop a long-range plan to get there. The second part is to design a high school experience to ensure that the student gains the skills and competencies needed to achieve his or her desired post-school goals. And third is identify and link students and families to any needed post-school services, supports, or programs before the student exits the school system. So these 3 things are sort of at this 30,000-foot view, this macro level. These are the things that the federal special ed regulations within the transition plan have tried to address. So there are things in place in the IEP, in the transition plan, that ultimately are trying to capture these 3 things. Okay? And we will get to that. I'll go in more in depth. So preparation. The student's high school program should thoroughly prepare him or her for achieving his or her desired post-school goals. The IEP, the Individualized Education Program, is the legal document reflecting the commitment made by the educational agency, so your school, to provide a free, appropriate public education designed to meet the unique needs of the student with a disability. The IEP should reflect the services and supports needed to assist the student in gaining those skills and experiences, and the connections to make the student's post-school goals a reality. Early transition planning is very important because it's a very complex array of connections that needs to happen outside of school with your other agencies that support students with disabilities, like voc rehab, developmental disability services, and potentially even Department of Labor. So because of those connections need to be addressed while that student is still in high school, and that's why we want to start planning. So transition from special ed services to, well, let me just back up. When a student is in high school and on an IEP, so they're eligible for special education, they have quite a bit of entitlements, things that the school is required to provide for that student. But when they leave high school, they do not have the same level of entitlement. So when a student graduates high school or exits high school and is no longer part of high school or even ages out, so when they turn 22, they move into an eligibility system, which is complicated. So that piece of it, the ball should already start rolling while that student is still in high school to plan for what that's going to be like when that student loses these entitlements. The student and the family need to be well aware of what that is going to shift to so that there's not as big of a cliff when that student graduates. And for students with severe disabilities and complex needs, it really does take time to put these post-school services and supports in place. It's not something you can throw together in the last 2 months of that kid's high school career. These are things that take at least a year or two to really plan out and do the right way. And transition planning actually starts when that student is 16. So it's actually the first IEP in effect after that student turns 16. So technically planning should start at 15. And if you have a student that's going to be in high school until beyond their 18th birthday and, maybe even through 21, then that's a lot, that's a long time for transition planning. And remember that graduation is, and this is just something I want to cover real quick. I actually don't have a slide that gets directly on this topic of graduation, but while I'm mentioning it. So graduation for a student on an IEP is not just about credits, okay? Credits are one piece of the puzzle. So when I say credits, I mean the graduation requirements for that school. So graduation is when that student meets those graduation credits, as well as that student has been offered reasonable and appropriate access to transition services. Those two things need to be in place in order for graduation to happen. You can have a student who's maybe, let's say, 19 and has met all of the graduation requirements and maybe was also on a multi-year plan, alternate credit accrual plan, which we'll talk about. So they've met their graduation requirements, but they have not yet received reasonable and appropriate access to transition services as determined by the IEP team. The team can decide to have that student come back for another year and just have the IEP focused on transition only. Again, we're talking prior to 22. When a student turns 22, entitlement to special education ends. Okay, so that was just a couple quick notes on graduation. There's typically questions that come up around that, so feel free to chime in on those. So some students will likely be using the services of many agencies, and time is needed to figure out who can do what and who's going to pay for what services. Which students need transition planning and why? A process designed to plan for life after graduation through identifying dreams, goals, instructional needs, and supports is beneficial for all students regardless of the extent or type of disability. IDEA, which is a federal special education law, requires that transition planning be included in the IEP for every student receiving special ed services beginning no later than the age of 16 or earlier when appropriate. An effective transition planning process, I don't think I'm going to read this whole slide, I might just scan through. So one quick note for all of the families out there. So, and I've seen this on some of the transition plans that I've reviewed. The student input is absolutely critical. So the student should be involved in this process and advocating for themselves and what their interests and desires are for what they want to do after graduation. And there's also an assessment process that helps sort of sync up that student's dreams and goals with what their skills and aptitudes are, so that then as a team, you can figure out what's a good career path for this student. But parents, you are also a really critical part to this, because sometimes students aren't always their best advocates, and they need you to be able to point out and remind them some of the things that they're good at and their interests, and you can really help drive the path that the team takes. And so anyway, you're just a critical part to all this, as is the student and the entire IEP team. But I just want to remind parents, make sure that when you come to a transition planning meeting, try to, before these meetings, brainstorm with your son or daughter, and even as a family, the different things that your son or daughter is really good at, and their interests and what they want to do. And some of the things may seem subtle and unrelated to even a career, but bring those up. It may be some subtle little skill that could then be applied to a type of job that you may not realize, but voc rehab, or even the special educator that's been trained around transition and employment training, or even a developmental services employment provider may be able to take that information and say, look, actually that sort of fits in with XYZ kinds of jobs. Why don't we do some career exploration in that area? So some of these folks that the IEP team is going to be inviting into the transition planning meeting have a certain level of expertise that is related to this kind of stuff. So if you can help translate and make sure they know what your son or daughter is really interested in, and what skills that they have that may not even come out on the assessments, that's going to really help the whole process and make it more effective. So an effective transition planning process, it provides awareness to students, families, educators in the community, and the adult service providers about what each system and person does, as well as facilitate communication. It develops the planning process, and it refocuses the school curriculum to include applied academics or functional academics, career development, and daily living. We utilize assessment information and effectively coordinate services between the school and other agencies. So we've already mentioned a little bit about this. So the first IEP in effect after the student turns 16 is the one that needs to start having the transition plan in the IEP. And okay, so now we're going to shift a little bit into the IEP and the transition plan. So there are 8 elements of a post-secondary transition plan in the IEP. Okay, and these elements capture the best practices that we talked about in the very first or second slide. Remember, we had those 3 big components. So the transition plan is broken into 8 elements that capture those 3 big items. And so the feds, so every state is required to have, every student that is on an IEP is required to have a transition plan after they turn 16. And then every state is required to report to the feds, our U.S. Department of Ed, on indicators about how we're doing in special education. And there are 20 indicators, and the indicator 13 is the one that each state reports back to the feds about how we're doing relative to transition. And actually indicator 14 is focused on what students who were on an IEP are doing 1 year after they graduate. Are they employed? Are they in a post-secondary education setting? So let's go through briefly the 8 elements of the transition plan, and I'm just going to quickly scan through the questions, and I think I'm going to address these as we get towards the end. So the 8 elements of the plan. So the transition plan in the IEP should show that there's evidence that the student was invited to the IEP team meeting. It should show that evidence of coordination with other agencies like voc rehab, developmental services. It should show that there has been an age-appropriate transition assessment that's been done. And we'll get to what that means. We're going to break down briefly each one of these 8 areas. It should have measurable post-secondary goals. It should have corresponding annual IEP goals. It should have, those goals should be updated annually. It should have transition services, and it should have course of study. So transition assessment is kind of more than you might think it is. So it's in the context of special education, transition assessment is an ongoing process of collecting data on the individual's needs, preferences, and interests as they relate to the demands of current and future working, educational, living, and personal and social environments. Assessment data serve as the common thread in the transition process and form the basis for defining goals and services to be included in the IEP. So the transition assessment should address 3 areas: employment, education and training, and independent living. Employment and education and training are required. Independent living is if appropriate. So depending on the student's disability and the IEP team's decision, it may only focus on the first 2 areas. So these are some example transition assessments. Classroom observation notes monthly, that were done monthly, August 2005 through April 2006. So that's one piece that counted as a transition assessment. So see the numbers here. There's 4 transition assessments here. And my point to all this is that a transition assessment is really a broad statement, and it's specific to the student and their disability as well. So a college-bound LD student or a student with a learning disability is going to have a different set of transition assessments than a student with a developmental disability. Community-based instruction, task analysis checks, August 2005 through April 2006. A transition planning inventory, student home and school forms was done, April 2006, and making action plans, the MAPS process, was completed in 2005. So there's an ongoing process of data collection around information that is relative to that student's needs, preferences, and interests. So post-secondary goals. These are goals that are actually outcomes. So they identify an outcome. They are to be written after, as though, upon graduation from high school, the student will do X, Y, Z. It's measurable. It's identifying an outcome, not a process. It's really a guidepost for what the student and the family and the IEP team hope that that student achieves after they graduate. And it should specifically be developed after doing the transition assessments so that you are collecting all sorts of data with the assessment process, and then you're building effective post-secondary goals, realistic post-secondary goals. If there's one big takeaway, it's that the transition assessment process is easily probably the most important part of this whole process, because if this isn't done well, then the goals are not going to have good information feeding them, and then the goals are probably not going to be as accurate or as sustainable or as effective or as successful. So the team should really spend some time on this area, making sure that you do a good job getting good information. on the transition learning community, which there is a link on at the end of this PowerPoint. It's actually a wiki, and it is the Vermont Transition Learning Community. I manage that website. There are 1,000 folks that are subscribed to it. I post announcements that are related to transition planning. But along the right-hand side of that site are all sorts of helpful documents and resources that are popular. And one of those resources is called the Transition Assessment Planning Form. And that is like the best thing you can do when if you have a student who's 15 and the team is sitting down to plan for what are the next steps, what assessments are we going to do. You want to bring that to that meeting. And this is what I train special educators to do this as well. So hopefully they'll bring that to the meeting. But it's a really great document to go through and show folks that it identifies who's going to do what are we going to measure, which assessments are we going to do, and when are we going to do it by. It organizes your team to make sure that you do a good job around the assessment process. Okay. So post-secondary goals. So remember, it's an outcome, and there are 3 areas, like we mentioned. So there's education and training and employment, which are required, and then there's independent living when appropriate. Okay, so then each post-secondary goal has a corresponding annual IEP goal. We sometimes call them IEP transition goals or annual transition goals. So for each one of these, there must be an annual goal, or sometimes multiple goals, included in the IEP that will help the student make progress towards the stated post-secondary goal. So remember that the post-secondary goal is sort of that guidepost for what the student is going to achieve after they graduate. The annual IEP goal is what that student is working on that annual year, that given year. And that annual goal is updated each year. The post-secondary goal may not necessarily be updated if it's still relevant. So, and that's why each year the team should be collecting more information, and not always, though. They don't always need to collect more information. If they did enough transition assessment work at the front end, the second or third year they might still have some good information that they can use. But it's always a good idea to start pulling in and get some more current information, especially around the interests and aptitudes. And then it's sort of a running list. Okay, so you start building up all these different assessments that have been done, and you can get information from them. So let's take a look here. So Lisette has Lisette is one of our case studies, and she was done by there's 14 different case studies, and all of them are listed on the Transition Learning Community via a link on the right-hand side. And again, before the end of today, I'll at least try to pull the site up and show you guys. So Lisette is a case study. She's a student with Down syndrome, and her post-secondary goal for independent living is that upon completion of high school, Lisette will utilize public transportation, including the public bus and uptown trolley, with time-limited supports provided through local rehab. Her annual IEP goal that corresponds to that is, given a bus schedule adapted with pictures, Lisette will select the correct time and stop for 5 scenarios of activities presented to her with 95% or better accuracy by December of the current school year. So sometimes when I am reviewing transition plans, now by the way, I'm not a monitor. I am more of I'm on the technical assistance side, so I do technical assistance and some coaching work with the special educators. But I also sometimes will review some of the IEPs that monitoring gets. and we will go through the Indicator 13 checklist. So there's a checklist that goes through each of those 8 elements I mentioned. And sometimes we'll see an annual IEP goal that is listed in the area, for independent living or employment, and it's really not connected to the post-secondary goal. So that's an issue. So what you want the annual IEP goal that is the corresponding goal for that post-secondary goal. Sometimes we do call them the annual transition goal. It should be totally connected and relevant to that post-secondary goal. It's basically, okay, team, how are we going to get this kid closer to that post-secondary goal for this current school year? What are we going to do? Okay, that's the goal, and it should be measurable. And then the following year, when that team meets and they decide that the post-secondary goal is still current, we're not going to change that, but we need to update the annual transition goal. And then then Lisette would have a new annual transition goal that's going to be higher level than the one you're looking at right now, right? All right. So we've talked about transition assessments. We've talked about post-secondary goals, annual transition goals. So we're sort of going down that list of those 8 items, and now you have transition services. So these are things that that should focus on academic and functional achievement to facilitate movement from school to post-school life. So for each post-secondary goal, transition services can include instruction, related services, community experience, community employment, internships, career exploration out in the community, development of employment and post-school objectives, daily living skills, functional vocational evaluation if appropriate. So these are things that the team needs to decide. Once you have done the transition assessments, you've built the post-secondary goal, and then you've built the annual goal that corresponds to that. Now you need to figure out what services need to be in place for that student to be successful with that annual goal, which is ultimately going to move that kid closer to the post-secondary goal. So you see how we're sort of reverse engineering things here. You start with the assessments, you build the guidepost, the post-secondary goal, then the annual goal, and then the transition services. So here's what's set. So on the left-hand side are assessments that were done, okay, and on the right are the transition services that she was given. So on the left we have results of performance on state-mandated assessments taken during high school indicate that Lisette is performing below average in math, reading, and written expression. Results of adaptive behavior checklists indicate that she has acquired many age-appropriate behaviors necessary for her to live independently and to function safely and appropriately in daily life. However, she continues to need support in this area. And community-based instruction task analysis checks indicate ability to work independently. One thing I just want to add that I don't think I emphasized before with the assessments, there should always be information that when an assessment is listed on the transition plan, there should be information about what info did that team gather that's relevant to that kid's transition. So see how the adaptive behavior checklist, it showed that she has many age-appropriate behaviors necessary for her to live independently and function safely. However, she continues to need support in this area. So they're not just listing they're doing a lot more than just listing the adaptive behavior checklist. They're translating it for whoever's going to be reading that IEP, that this is what we got. This is the information that we learned from that assessment. Okay. So then you have transition services on the right-hand side, so education and training. She's going to have instruction on community safety skills. She's going to have travel instruction and using the public transportation, math instruction around money usage and telling time, literacy instruction related to sight word identification, instruction related to community safety at the YMCA, and employment. She's going to purchase a monthly bus pass, safety skills in the community, learn to use the pull cord to identify her upcoming stop. So for those of you that have seen the Vermont transition plan in the IEP, I actually designed that. And so when you're looking at the template, it has, it's broken into education and training, and then employment, and then independent living. And so education and training, that section has the post-secondary goal, the annual goal, and then the transition services. So each of those areas should be lumped together so you can just see at a glance, okay, education and training, here's your post-secondary goal, here's your annual transition goal, and here's her transition services for that area, right? Because right now what I'm doing, the PowerPoint, I'm sort of pulling things out and showing you. And by the way, there are 3 transition plan samples on the Transition Learning Community website. And Lisette, I believe actually her transition plan is on there, and I put it into the Vermont forms. Okay, so the next area is the course of study. Okay, this can be confusing for people. Basically, it's a multi-year description of coursework that are specifically going to help that student meet their desired post-school goals from the current to the anticipated exit year. So it's not every single course under the sun that student's going to take. It's just the ones that the team is saying, hey, look, these are really the key ones that are connected to this kid's transition plan, so let's list them here. And if that student is, let's say, a sophomore, okay, what courses are connected to that kid? Well, let's say they're 16 and they're a sophomore. What courses are connected to that kid's transition plan right now in their sophomore year? Okay, what about their junior year and their senior year? Let's plan out and make sure we're making sure we list the ones that are really key that we want that kid to take. Okay, that's it. It doesn't need to be a really elaborate thing here. It's just a list of these key courses. And then for students that are on a multi-year plan, okay, which we also call an alternative credit accrual plan. And the name is likely going to change officially from multi-year plan to alternate credit accrual plan, an ACAP. And what that is I'm just going to jump to that for a second. This is how Vermont does one diploma for all kids. Okay, some states unfortunately do something called an IEP diploma, which I'm not a fan of. In Vermont, we're very lucky. We have one diploma for all students. Okay, and so what it is it allows for a student. So based on the severity of that student's disability, if they are not able to earn their credits in the same manner that their non-disabled peers do, and when I say credits, I mean the graduation requirements, then they can do an alternative credit accrual plan and get credit for the required course by taking a course that they can take. So, for example, instead of algebra, the student is going to do life skills math. Instead of phys ed, they may do taekwondo, although there's so much happening in the world of adapted phys ed that that's hopefully would be able to be addressed right in the phys ed class. But you start getting my drift. The Vermont forms on the back of the transition plan actually have the alternate credit accrual plan chart, and it just has these columns. Here's the required graduation credit, and here's the course that the student is going to take, and here's just a brief statement why they're going to do it that way. And it's typically due to the severity of their disability. So let's just go back. We were talking about course of study. Okay, remember that's that list of each of the key courses. Is the student's course of study preparing them for their post-secondary goals? These are questions that the team should be asking themselves. And then here are some examples and some non-examples actually. So examples: math 2, English, adapted PE, career, social studies, applied math, home economics, career and technical. So by the way, these don't correspond to the other case study we were talking about with Lisette. This is a different example. These are the courses that Diana will complete from her current year in high school through graduation. They are directly related to her post-secondary education and employment goals. Having a statement like that is very helpful. Non-examples: a box is checked on the IEP indicating that the student is completing standard coursework for graduation. The plan is minimally acceptable if it includes only the student's current year courses related to post-secondary goals. So this is actually a slide the monitoring team uses sometimes when they're doing trainings, and just wanted to give you an example there. Okay, so now we have the summary of performance. Okay, this is actually separate from the IEP. Okay, it's part of the special education process, and it's required for all kids who are on an IEP prior to graduation. They're required to be issued a summary of performance from your school. Okay, so this typically isn't issued until a month or two, sometimes earlier, prior to graduation. And the student should be heavily involved in creating it. In fact, they should be the driver. And the parent, of course, family is involved. And what this is, okay, is a summary of, it's sort of at a glance of what is this student really good at, and what are some of the challenges that this student has. Essentially what this is it's taking everything that if I can for a second act like I'm talking to the special educators here, so and the IEP team. It's everything you've learned about this student over the years that has worked for this student, has been successful, as well as some of the challenges and what are some tips to work through them. And it's put into this document. And again, you want the student to be the driver of writing this, because they need to be comfortable with these things, because this is a document that's going to go to either an employer or to a student support office at a college. And it's up to that student if they want to use it. So it's issued to the student should help write it, and then it's issued to them. And it's a piece of information. It's sort of bridging a gap. It's sort of their passport. It's their exit visa that's going to go with them. Okay? And it's up to them if they want to use it. Some students when they leave high school want to have nothing to do with, they don't want people to know that they were on an IEP and things like that. Whereas other students, with the encouragement, of course, of their parents, take it and they give it to the student support office at the college. Okay? And this is relatively new. When I say relative, I mean it's been around for 6 or 7 years. But the feds created this because what was happening with the post-secondary education world is that these colleges were requiring all sorts of new evaluations right before that kid graduated. And if the student is not up for a new 3-year re-eval, the school is not required to do additional evaluations. They are required to do the summary of performance, though. And that's why the feds created this. The feds wanted this to be able to go to colleges to satisfy the information they were trying to get. Now, the other evaluations, of course, if the student and the family are okay with it, can go to the college if they're asking, the ones that have already been done. But definitely the summary performance should go. And the nice thing that is happening now, we live in an era that all of our state colleges now have a student support office, and these are folks that I'd say in the last 15 years there's been a major shift, and these folks really are familiar with disabilities. Some of them were even prior, had been special educators. There's just a lot more opportunity out there around supports, But just remember, when a student leaves high school, they leave those entitlements. So there's no special education in college. Okay, they're protected under ADA, the Federal Civil Rights Act, and some accommodations, but there's no special education. But the student support offices are there to help, and the student should go and meet with these folks. If they're college bound, they should, that as part of their transition process, at least on the family side of things, you should be going there and meeting with these folks so that the student knows where to go for help. If they need accommodations, the student support office is who would handle that. And just real quick, I'm going to show you an example summary of performance, and then we'll go back to the PowerPoint. So this is a sample of a student named Roy, who's a student with Asperger's. I'm just going to go quickly through here because I want to make sure we have enough time to get through these questions. So the student has post-secondary goals that are listed, and then it has some information about academic performance. So just imagine you're an employer or you're in a student support office and you're receiving this document. You're going to start to be able to glean some information about the student that's going to be helpful for working with the student. So Roy experiences some difficulty in organization and time management skills. He's using a planner to keep all of his schedules and events organized. Community employment. With support, he can perform a few basic duties like taping, logging, injury treatment in the training room. So this was a sample case study that I created. A student with Asperger's who was working in the training room. Has a job coach, can help him with his, actually having a job coach to help him get to know his supervisor better. Students with Asperger's, as many of you know, have difficulty with the social interaction and communication. Roy's working on achieving his goals in his transition plan, hopes to be accepted at UVM. He has benefited from a teacher mentor when in the community doing career observation. So anyway, it just sort of lists the strengths and needs as well as accommodations that were given. Okay, and then it has a student perspective to it. Now this example is also on the Transition Learning Community, and there's a blank template on there as well if you're a special educator out there and you need a copy of this. So this was a sample. This is the italics are the student's writing, or the sort of a fictional student here. I had our autism consultant write this. Anyway, so this is on the website as well. I just wanted to give you an example. So let's go back to the PowerPoint, and then I want to make sure that we address all of the questions. And I just want to view from our current slide. Okay, I was hoping it wouldn't do that. All right. So just bear with me for a sec. Okay, so we talked about the multi-year plan. So here are some guiding questions for IEP teams. Where is a student going vocationally, competitive or supported employment or volunteer work? Will a student need post-secondary education? Where is a student going to live? What will a student's transportation needs be? And I can put this PowerPoint up on the Transition Learning Community. I don't think I've done that, so I'm making a note of that. I'll make sure that's up. And so here is the link. And in fact, might as well just click on this right now. Oops. See if it'll let me. Okay, I don't think I can get to that site right now. But that's where you want to go, and that has all of those resources I mentioned. And if you want to become a subscriber so that you receive the notifications, in the upper right-hand corner, if you're not already a subscriber, it says Request Access. Okay, the site is just a public site. Anybody can go to it. But if you want to get the updates and the notifications when I add new resources, for instance, I just added new information about the Think College sites and the Mansfield Hall, which is a new college support opportunity for students in the Burlington area. That information is all on the Transition Learning Community. So just click Request Access, enter your email, and then you'll get those notifications when I add updates. And then again, along the right-hand side are all the popular, helpful resources. So now let's, I'm going to just go through the questions from the top here, and hopefully we have time here. So, my son, I'm going to read the question and then try to answer it. So my son is out of high school. He is 19, however, is enrolled for school for services until he turns 22. Will this program still be of use for him? Absolutely, it will. The more prep that you can do prior to graduation to prepare that student for life after high school is going to be beneficial. Does the parent need to approve the invitation of outside parties to an IEP team meeting? Yes, they do. And the special educator or the special ed director should be asking you for that permission. Will a copy of the PowerPoint be available after the webinar? Yes, I'm going to post this on the Transition Learning Community, and the link is right on your page. You might not be able to click right on it through the webinar, but if you might be able to, no, you probably won't even be able to copy it in case it just, you'll have to go and you can just try to Google that. And it's also listed on the VFN site. If the annual IEP meeting is in January 2013 and the student turns 16 in July of 2012, when does the transition plan need to be in place? Is it the IEP in place at the end of the school year in 2012? So if the IEP meeting is in January, so the annual is in January. So yes, January 2013 is when the transition plan would need to begin, because it's the first IEP in effect after the student turns 16. So that students turn 16, and then the next annual IEP is when the transition plan needs to be in place. As a sibling, did you observe anything in your family's transition planning that was something that you wish had gone better? That's a good question. Now you're really making me think. Let me just think about this for a second. So one of my siblings, Ben, he had a really amazing transition, and CVU gave him a chance to try out several different jobs, and he still has that same job to this day, and he's worked a variety of different parts of the store, but mostly, and he loves it. He works at the Hannafords in Williston, and he just loves it. And my other brother has had a lot more behavioral kinds of issues, so you know, the school really did everything they could, but I'd say that the lion's share of the real work happened after he graduated with the developmental services provider, the community employment provider. And he does have a couple internships, but does not have paid employment yet just because of his behavior. So anyway, I'm not sure if that totally answers it, but I think that due to my younger brother's behavior, the school was sort of limited in what they could try to do out in the community, and that makes it really difficult. So behavioral challenges out in the community really have a big impact on how much community exploration and community employment preparation can happen. How is Vermont doing in regard to Indicator 13? So we don't have so there's not really a good answer for that right now, because it's been so sort of discombobulated, if you will, because the feds have changed their the requirements a little bit. And not only that, when we first, as a state, when we first started doing Indicator 13, we were being incredibly rigorous, like more than other states, and so our data would come out not as good. So we have since received guidance from the feds so that our monitoring process is more in line with other states. and is not as rigorous as we were being. And so that new data is not out yet. So, but just anecdotally, over the last 6 or 7 years that I've been at the Agency of Ed, I've seen a huge improvement in the transition plans and the IEPs from all over the state. Let's see. So as a sibling, let's see. My 17-year-old son reads at a 4th grade level. Does age-appropriate assessment mean that he should be given an assessment for a 17-year-old or for a student who reads at the 4th grade level? So the assessment information should be relevant and pertinent to your child. So it should be specific to your child. So it could still be age appropriate, but not have maybe a reading part that he or she would need to do. So as long as it is specifically addressed, remember the assessment process is sort of a broad statement. It's looking at things like task analysis checks, work behaviors, and a variety of things. So you're not really limited by the reading level there. All right, so let's just go down here. Do you know what % of students who had IEPs were working after graduating from high school? So we do not have really good, clean data on that because that's getting an indicator 14, which is what are students doing 1 year after they graduate. And what we have run into is that, so 1 year after students graduate, their contact information is not always accurate. So we try to have schools get those phone numbers so that we have them in our system, and then we can do the indicator 14 survey, but we do not always have the good numbers, and other states struggle with this as well. So we don't have a really good idea of that right off the top of our head. So, and the other thing is we have a position at DOE that completely covers data. And so I'm not as good with answering these data questions. We have a person that can answer this stuff right off the top of the head and could tell you the % based on what we have for both indicator 13 and 14. And I apologize, I don't have that right off the top of my head. So my student's IEP team has never used MAPS or Coach, and I think my daughter would benefit from this process. What should I do? So you just simply would ask the special educator, and there are other kinds of processes that or assessments that the team could do that would be getting at, and the school may do something similar that's really getting at the same concept. So just talk with your IEP team about that. How long should the assessment process take? So ideally, at the onset, it should start when that student is 15. And it's going to vary by team, but there's not really any sort of hard and fast rule on how long it should take. But remember, it's an ongoing process of data collection. So the team is collecting more and more assessment data each year. But I'd say when that student's 15, the team should be spending a good at least 2 or 3 months collecting information that's really going to help them when they write that first transition plan when that kid turns 16. Remember, you put that work into the transition assessment, it's going to make the rest of the transition plan and writing the transition plan and the success of the transition plan so much more likely. So assessment is really important. Put the energy into that, and then the other things just start falling into place. My daughter's IEP case manager doesn't seem to know much about the various transition assessments. Where do special educators go for information on these assessments? So they go to the transition learning community. There are a variety of resources there, and they can also email me, and I also go out to schools and do trainings as well. My daughter's IEP case manager doesn't seem to know much. Oh, sorry, I just read that one. How many schools develop transition plans to the level of detail that you are explaining? It seems that my daughter's school has neither the expertise or the resources to develop a quality plan. To be honest, I just looked at a couple of transition plans the other day, and they were of similar quality to the sample samples that we just looked at, one of the issues that just came up at one of the ones was that the annual transition goals were not specifically tied to the post-secondary goals. They were a little bit generic. So remember I showed that annual transition goal. You really want that to be very functional, very specific, very specifically tied to that post-secondary goal. How many schools? Okay. Let's see. Okay, I just need to scroll down a little bit here. Do you review samples of transition plans from various Vermont high schools? If so, what are the areas of strength and what are the areas that need improvement? Our monitoring team would be able to answer that a little bit better. They review a much higher volume than I do of them, but like I said, one of them is the making sure that the annual goals are closely connected to the post-secondary goals. The other thing I sometimes see is that they'll list assessments, but then there's nothing else there. So I don't know what information did they gather from those assessments. And there should be a nice little summary on there. So let's say they did 3, 4, 5 different assessments. Okay, great. What information did you get out of those that's informing your process, the transition plan and the goals? So make sure that that is included. Is it fair to say that because of this post-secondary emphasis, our kids are less mainstream as they go along in high school, less than in elementary school? No, I wouldn't say that at all. If anything, I mean, what an IEP is really trying to do is level the playing field for students with disabilities. So, so their non-disabled peers, they're out there, so, you know, they're getting their licenses and they're getting jobs, and so this is trying to level that playing field, okay? And special education is all about access to the general ed curriculum. And in a way, what transition planning is doing is giving that student access to the community employment that the non-disabled peers are already getting on their own. So again, we're just trying to level the playing field here. Are summaries of performance required for all students on IEPs? Yes. So any student who graduated who was on an IEP and is still eligible for special ed prior to graduation, it's required that the school issues a summary of performance. Okay? And remember, when they graduate, special education ends. Okay? And the summary of performance is what goes with them as they leave and head off into the next chapter of their life. Is it the case manager's job to make sure this is done, or is it more of the entire IEP team that should write this? I'd say all of the above. I mean, the case manager is the one that should sort of remind everybody and make sure that you're getting the process started. And then absolutely it's done as a team, again, with a huge emphasis on letting the student drive the process as much as possible. Again, this is a document going with them. It's actually not even really going with the parent. I mean, of course, the parent will probably have a copy, but this student really needs to be comfortable with this. They need to own this. And sometimes, you know, students don't want people to know that they were on an IEP, so it can be a rough balance there. But again, whatever that student is comfortable with, and they need to help drive that process. Yeah, let's just go down. We're almost done with questions here. Just to share, college-bound students with special needs should check out the Succeed program at UVM, and the Think College Vermont is also offered at UVM. Absolutely, totally agree. These are great programs. So more than ever, there's more opportunities now than there ever has been. So UVM has Think College. Johnson State also has Think College. And the Chittenden County area also has the Succeed program. Well, actually, it's part of UVM is connected to that as well. So that's through the Howard Center. And all of these are college experiences for students with disabilities, and actually developmental disabilities. And there's also an organization called College Steps. Go ahead and Google that, and they are really a first of its kind probably in the country. They are a college support organization, and they have created essentially a Think College model at Linden State, Castleton State, I think they're developing one at Norwich and possibly CCV. And these are very similar to the Think College model, if you're familiar with that, where each student with a disability has a mentor who is a general matriculating student. It's just an amazing program. Check out the website. There's information on the transition learning community about it. I'm absolutely a huge fan of Think College and College Steps. Definitely check these programs out. And again, these are for students with developmental disabilities. Let's see. So we can also post the PowerPoint, yep, on the VFN site. Do you see evidence in transition plans of teams working towards reducing a student's dependence on supports? Okay, great question, and absolutely, when I'm out doing trainings, it is absolutely necessary for the team to try to explore this concept of fading the support or fading the para, making the student more self-directed, more, you want that student to have that ability to advocate for themselves, to know be familiar with their disability, and the transition planning process should have objectives and goals around this that are really shifting that towards the student and starting to fade. You know, if they have a para-educator, for instance, they're learning to fade the para or fading some of the intensive services so that the student has to rely more on themselves for things like transportation. Okay, I want to get to the last few questions here. Do you see evidence? Okay, so would you be available to look at my student's transition plan and give me your thoughts? I typically don't like to get too involved in that because it puts me in a rough situation with the school. So I am available for technical assistance to the entire team. So if the parent and the school says, hey John, we'd love to have you chime in on a phone call and give us some technical assistance, I'm very happy to do that. If it's just on the parent, they can certainly call me. But if I'm going to give technical assistance on an IEP, I would much rather be much more comfortable to have the school involved, and we just do it together as a larger sort of team. But again, I'm not a team member. I would be giving technical assistance to the team. What recourse do I have as a parent if my daughter's school has not developed a comprehensive transition plan or isn't following it? So you would be able to just engage your parental rights. So there are, the easiest thing to do is just to first start with the case manager and express your concern, okay, and see if you can work it out that way. That's the first go-to. If that doesn't work, try the special ed director and see if you can work it out that way. If that doesn't work, then the next best step is to ask for mediation. And the school would need to agree to that as well. And there are professional mediators that the Agency of Education would assign. And that's typically a pretty helpful process because whatever comes out of the mediation, it's sort of like a settlement agreement. And the mediation can, if that doesn't go well, mediation can go into a due process. And then there's also the parent could do an administrative complaint as well. But like I said, honestly, try to just work it out with the special ed case manager first. Talk to them. See if what you can do there. Start there, and then work through it that way. Is it okay to go a bit past 11? Okay. And then, do IEPs include goals for students to get involved in peer self-advocacy groups? That's a great question, and absolutely it could. There's no reason it couldn't, and I think I actually have seen something like that on an IEP before, but that's a great idea. That, again, the goal of transition in special ed is that, we're doing whatever we can do to prepare this kid to be as successful as possible. And that means that we have to start fading some of our services and supports. We need to be teaching them self-advocacy, self-directed behavior, learning how to use public transportation, learning how to ask for help, learning how to communicate their needs, learning about their disability, like the ins and outs of it. They should have a, as best we can, we need to prepare these kids so that they have all these things. I mean, so rather than giving them really intensive paraeducator support all the way through, and then it just becomes a major cliff right when they graduate. It just falls off, and it's a sort of a shock to the system. We need to ease that transition so that it's not a cliff. And again, I know that for some of our students who have severe disabilities or medically involved disabilities, that may not be realistic to do any of that fading, because actually when they leave high school, they're going to have intensive supports through the developmental disability office. So it's actually not going to be a cliff as bad for them. So, but again, the transition process is communicating and making sure that developmental services agency is all set up, and that's going to make parents feel better, to make special educators feel better, to make the students feel better, knowing what they're getting, what they're going to be facing when they leave high school. So I would just like to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. Please take a moment to complete the short evaluation and note on there if you would like to have a certificate of completion. As a reminder, this webinar will be archived on Vermont Family Network's website along with many other previously recorded webinars. Be sure to visit VFN's website at www.vermontfamilynetwork.org for a complete list of upcoming webinars, workshops, and support groups. And also don't forget about the April 10th conference. And have a good day. Thanks. Take care.